You've noticed something strange happening. The friends you used to spend every weekend with no longer feel like your people. The conversations that used to energize you now feel hollow. You're participating, but you're not present, nodding along to discussions that seem to be happening in a language you used to speak fluently, but have somehow forgotten. The activities that once defined your social existence now feel like obligations you're fulfilling out of habit rather than desire. Meanwhile, the people you want to become like, the men who've built what you're building toward, who embody what you're trying to embody, they don't know you exist. You're not in their rooms. You're not in their conversations. You haven't earned access to the spaces they occupy. You can see where you're headed, but you haven't arrived. You can see where you came from, but you can no longer live there. You're standing between two worlds, belonging to neither. The old world rejected you the moment you started changing. The new world hasn't accepted you because you haven't finished becoming. The loneliness isn't circumstantial, it's structural. It's not that you happen to be alone. It's that the stage you're in requires aloneness as condition of its completion. This stage has a purpose you can't see from inside it. The isolation that feels like punishment is actually preparation. The disconnection that seems like loss is actually clearing space for what's coming. The emptiness that threatens to break you is carving capacity for what you'll need to hold. Today, we're examining the lonely stage that precedes elevation, not to romanticize suffering. Suffering isn't automatically noble, but to map the terrain so you recognize where you are when you find yourself there. The man who understands the purpose of the stage he's in navigates it differently than the man who thinks something has gone wrong. The masculine journey follows patterns that cross circumstance. The wealthy man's son and the poor man's son both face similar trials. The content differs, but the structure persists. Both experience rejection, both face failure, both encounter betrayal by people they trusted, both navigate disappointment that threatened to define them. These trials aren't aberrations, they're curriculum. The struggle you're experiencing isn't evidence that your path went wrong. It's evidence that you're on the path at all. The man whose life contains no difficulty isn't blessed. He's either lying or living so safely that he's avoiding the terrain where growth occurs. Most men begin in some form of chaos. The chaos appears differently depending on circumstance. Economic instability that made survival dominate attention. Households without emotional presence. Parents physically there but psychologically absent. Environments where nobody modeled what healthy relationship to self, others, or purpose actually looks like. The chaos creates confusion that extends far beyond childhood. The man raised without guidance develops compensations that feel like personality but are actually adaptations to dysfunction. The confidence he never developed gets covered by bravado that doesn't quite convince. The emotional literacy nobody taught him remains absent while he builds coping mechanisms that work until they don't. Two destinations commonly emerge from this chaos. Some men develop destructive patterns, substances, behaviors, relationships that damage rather than build. The chaos outside gets internalized as chaos inside, and the chaos inside finds expression through choices that compound difficulty rather than resolving it. Other men develop aimlessness, no destruction, exactly no obvious addiction, no dramatic dysfunction, just drift. Days that pass without accumulating toward anything. Years that elapse without progression toward purpose. Life that happens rather than life that's built. The absence of destruction gets mistaken for presence of direction when actually neither exists. Both destinations share underlying emptiness. The man destroying himself and the man drifting nowhere both experience the same fundamental absence of meaning that makes getting up each morning feel like effort that produces nothing. The surface manifestation differ. The core condition is identical. Life moves in cycles that repeat until something interrupts them. The same relationship pattern, the same financial pattern, the same emotional pattern, the same circumstances appearing with different faces, producing the same outcomes, confirming the same conclusions about how life works and what you deserve from it. The cycles feel like fate, like you're trapped in something you didn't choose and can't escape. The evidence accumulates. Here it is again, the same thing happening. Proof that this is just how your life goes. The interpretation seems undeniable because the pattern keeps providing confirming data. But the cycles aren't fate. They're feedback. The pattern keeps repeating because the thing that produces the pattern hasn't changed. You keep ending up in the same situations because you keep making the same decisions, running the same unconscious programs, approaching life with the same orientations that produce the outcomes you're experiencing. Again, breaking cycles requires breaking the self that produces them, not modification of the self, termination of the self. The identity that created your current patterns cannot create different patterns while remaining intact. The transformation required isn't improvement, it's replacement. The old version has to die for the new version to emerge. This death is what most men avoid. The destruction seems too complete. The identity they've constructed, even if it's producing terrible outcomes, feels like who they are. Abandoning it feels like abandoning existence itself. So they cling to the very patterns that are destroying them because the patterns feel safer than the unknown that would replace them. The awakening arrives through various channels, sometimes through books that articulate what couldn't be articulated before, sometimes through mentors whose example demonstrates what's possible, sometimes through podcasts, content, communities that provide language and frameworks for understanding what's been happening and what could happen differently. Sometimes the awakening comes through crisis, the destruction reaches bottom that can't be ignored. The drift extends so long that the emptiness becomes undeniable. Something breaks that was holding the previous structure together, and the breaking creates opening for something new. The awakening feels like waking up inside a life you've been sleepwalking through. The same circumstances surround you, but you see them differently. The patterns you couldn't name suddenly have names. The dynamics you were subject to without understanding become visible in ways that create possibility for response rather than mere reaction. What follows awakening is the work, the replacement of what was with what could be. The habits that serve destruction or drift get replaced by habits that serve purpose. The daily behaviors that accumulated damage get replaced by daily behaviors that accumulate building. The work is unglamorous. It's getting up early when getting up late is easier. It's saying no to what used to feel essential. It's doing the thing you know you should do when every part of you wants to do otherwise. The work is hundreds of small choices that nobody sees, each choice creating trajectory that only reveals itself over time. The inner voice changes. The voice that used to narrate your inadequacy, that kept confirming the unworthiness the chaos installed. This voice gets replaced by something different. Not false positivity, not delusion, but accuracy that includes possibility, rather than accuracy that only includes limitation. The way you treat others changes not through performance, but through overflow. The integrity that you're building internally expresses itself in how you engage with people. The standards you're holding yourself to extend into standards for how you conduct relationships. The person you're becoming treats people differently than the person you were. When the internal work accumulates sufficiently, something shifts in outcomes. The results that weren't coming start appearing, not through luck, through alignment. The actions that match purpose produce outcomes that match intention. The cause and effect that seemed broken during the chaos starts operating in ways that favor rather than hinder. But here's what nobody tells you. Before the outcomes fully materialize, something else happens. Something that doesn't feel like progress. Something that feels like regression. Something that makes you wonder whether the work was worth it at all. The lonely stage arrives. The people who knew the old you no longer fit the person you're becoming. The conversations that used to feel natural now feel like translations between languages that don't quite map onto each other. You're sitting with friends you've had for years and realizing that what connects you isn't deeper than shared history and proximity. This isn't judgment of them. They haven't done anything wrong. They're still the same people they've always been. You're the one who changed. The relationship that worked when you were both in the same place stops working when you've moved and they've stayed. The pull backward is powerful. The loneliness creates a vacuum that the familiar could fill. The old friends are still there. The old activities are still available. The old version of yourself could be resumed with minimal effort. The gap between where you are and where you came from feels smaller than the gap between where you are and where you're going. Some men close this gap backward. The loneliness becomes intolerable and they return. They pick up the dropped habits. They reconnect with the abandoned relationships. They resume the drift or the destruction that feels terrible, but at least feels familiar. The lonely stage defeats them because they interpret it as evidence that change was a mistake. The interpretation is wrong, but understandable. The stage feels like punishment. Feels like the universe demonstrating that you shouldn't have tried to become something different. Feels like confirmation that people like you don't get to have what you were reaching for. The evidence seems clear. Look how alone you are now, but the evidence is misread. The loneliness isn't punishment, it's transition. The isolation isn't rejection, it's incubation. The space that opened when the old world released you is space that the new world hasn't filled yet. The gap isn't permanent condition, it's throughput. You're in the hallway between rooms. You've left one room and the door has closed behind you. The other room exists, but its door hasn't opened yet. The hallway is uncomfortable because hallways aren't meant for habitation. They're meant for traversal. You're not supposed to stay here, but you have to pass through here. to get where you're going. The confusion that accompanies this stage is disorienting. You're no longer who you were. That identity has been shed. You're not yet who you're becoming. That identity hasn't fully formed. You're in the strange intermediate space where the old self has died, but the new self hasn't fully been born. This intermediate space produces experiences that don't fit previous categories. You find yourself unable to enjoy things that used to satisfy you. You find yourself unable to fully engage with things that should satisfy the new version of you. Everything feels partially real, partially distant, partially out of focus. People sense something different about you, not through anything you're saying or doing overtly, through something less visible. The changes you've made internally express themselves through your presence, your energy, something that doesn't have precise name, but that others detect without knowing what they're detecting. Some people are drawn to the change. They sense something they want to be around. They notice the shift even if they can't articulate it. These may become the new relationships that eventually replace what you've lost, but they're not here yet, or not fully here, or not developed enough to constitute the community you need. Other people are repelled by the change. They sense that you're no longer what they can relate to. They sense that the common ground you used to share has eroded. They may not become hostile, they just become absent. The drift happens naturally because the connection that maintained the relationship has dissolved. The women who used to interest you may no longer interest you. The standards that used to govern your attraction have shifted. What you were willing to accept when you were the previous version no longer seems acceptable now that you're becoming the current version. The pool shrinks even as your value increases. The women who might interest the future, you don't know you exist yet. You haven't arrived at the places where they are. You haven't demonstrated the status that would draw their attention. You're in the gap where the old romantic patterns have ended, but the new romantic patterns haven't begun. This applies to all relationships, not just romantic ones. The friends who would align with the person you're becoming haven't entered your life yet. The mentors who would guide the next stage haven't appeared yet. The community that would support your continued development hasn't formed yet. You're alone because the network that matches who you're becoming is still assembling. The temptation to return intensifies during this period. The old world is still there, still accessible. The barrier to re-entry is low. You could resume what you left behind with minimal effort. The familiarity calls to you, promising relief from the isolation you're experiencing. Every man who goes through this stage faces this fork. Continue forward through the loneliness towards something that hasn't materialized yet, or turn back toward certainty of the familiar, toward the world that doesn't serve you but at least knows your name. Most men turn back. The statistics aren't available because nobody tracks this, but observation suggests that most men who begin the journey don't complete it. The lonely stage breaks them. The isolation exceeds what they can tolerate. The faith required to continue without evidence exceeds what they can sustain. The return often happens gradually, not dramatic decision, but slow erosion. The habits that were being built start slipping. The standards that were being held start relaxing. The direction that was being maintained starts drifting. By the time the return is complete, it often looks like it was inevitable rather than chosen. What happens to the men who don't return? They stay in the hallway longer than is comfortable. They endure the isolation without letting it drive them backward. They maintain the practices that they developed even when the practices don't seem to be producing results. They continue becoming who they're becoming, even when the becoming feels pointless. The staying is itself the work, not additional work beyond what they were already doing. The staying is what the stage demands, the capacity to be alone without returning to what made them not alone before, the capacity to trust what they can't see, because what they can see isn't providing evidence. The mindset that carries men through this stage involves particular understanding of how life operates, the recognition that external circumstances reflect internal conditions, that the outside eventually mirrors the inside, that the work being done internally will eventually express itself externally, but on timelines that can't be controlled and through mechanisms that can't be predicted. The men who understand this keep working on the inside even when the outside hasn't shifted yet. They keep building the mindset, the habits, the orientation, even when the results haven't appeared. They recognize that the lag between internal change and external change is real, and they operate within that lag without losing faith that the lag will close. The men who don't understand this look at external circumstances for validation of internal work. When the external validation doesn't come quickly enough, they conclude that the internal work isn't working. The conclusion leads to abandonment of the work, which guarantees that the external results will never arrive. If everyone was suddenly given identical resources, identical circumstances, identical starting points within relatively short time, people would redistribute toward levels that match their internal conditions. The man whose mindset generates wealth would regenerate wealth. The man whose mindset generates poverty would return to poverty. The external is effect, the internal is cause. This is why working on the internal is the only work that matters. The circumstances you're trying to change are symptoms. The mindset that produces them is cause. Changing symptoms without changing cause creates temporary relief that reverts. Changing cause eventually changes symptoms, but the eventually can feel very long when you're inside it. The lonely stage is where the internal work gets tested. The isolation strips away external props that might have been supporting you. The feedback from others that was confirming your progress disappears. You're alone with the changes you've made, unable to verify them through external response. What remains? The practices you've developed remain. The habits you've built remain. The voice you've cultivated inside your head remains. The relationship you've built with yourself remains. Everything external has been removed, and you discover what was really there all along. What was yours versus what was borrowed from circumstances that have now changed. The men who survived this stage are men who built something real. The practices weren't performances for others. They were genuine development of self. The habits weren't maintained for approval. They were maintained because they served something the man had internalized. The inner voice wasn't borrowed. It was cultivated through work that happened when nobody was watching. The men who don't survive this stage are men whose changes were more performative than they realized. When the audience disappeared, the motivation disappeared with it. When the external confirmation stopped arriving, the internal conviction wasn't strong enough to continue without it. This isn't moral judgment. The difference often isn't about character. It's about depth of transformation. The man whose transformation penetrated deeply enough survives. The man whose transformation remains surface level, even if he didn't know it was surface level, doesn't survive. The stage reveals what was real versus what was aesthetic. The stage also builds something that couldn't have been built any other way. The capacity to be alone without collapsing. The capacity to trust internal conviction when external evidence contradicts it. The capacity to continue when the sensible thing would be to stop. These capacities only develop through circumstances that demand them. The man who emerges from the lonely stage isn't the same man who entered it. The passage itself transforms. The capacities he developed during the isolation become part of him permanently. The faith he built when there was nothing to have faith in doesn't disappear when circumstances improve. The self-sufficiency he was forced into becomes foundation rather than emergency measure. The loneliness eventually ends, not through willpower alone, through the internal changes finally expressing themselves externally. The person he's become starts attracting different circumstances. The energy he carries starts drawing different people. The presence that developed during the isolation starts creating new connections. The new connections aren't like the old ones. They're not based on shared dysfunction or mutual drift. They're based on alignment with who he's become. The people who enter his life now enter because they resonate with the current version, not because they're remnants of relationships that formed before the transformation began. The women who become available are different women than before. Not better in absolute sense, different in kind. They match who he is now rather than who he was. The relationships that become possible are relationships the previous version couldn't have accessed because the previous version wouldn't have attracted them.